What's up guys, Mike here, the Detroit Borg with the brand new iPhone XR in all 6 colors. Now the iPhone XR is the first time Apple has produced an all-new design that slots below its flagship smartphones. I think it's the most interesting new iPhone of the year. It starts at $749 and gives you a design and performance experience very similar to the flagships which start at $1,000. So we get 3 capacity options, 64, 128, or 256 gigs, and the most you can spend on an iPhone XR is $899. But of course, the signature new feature of the iPhone XR are color options, much more vibrant than the ones you get on the stainless steel iPhone XS and XS Max. So when it comes to unboxing these iPhones, you have to take a moment to admire this packaging, especially with all colors side by side. So you can see each color of the iPhone illustrated on the top of the box with that wallpaper which matches the phone. And of course, those wallpapers are available on the phone itself, and we'll get to that. Even the text and the Apple logos on the side of the box have a metallic color which matches the aluminum finish of the iPhone. So to speed this up, the first thing I have to do is remove the plastic surrounding each box. There's a pull tab on the side, and all you have to do is pull that and it peels off pretty easily. No knives needed. So once we get the plastic out of the way, we can go ahead and lift the lids of all of these boxes. The first thing we see here, of course, is the paperwork packet. And the one that stands out right away is the product red version. So all of these packets are the same except for the product red version, which gets an additional pamphlet. So that product red flyer just tells you about the product red foundation. So when you purchase one of these phones, a portion of the proceeds goes to that foundation. The rest of the paperwork is identical for each box. We get a quick start guide, a SIM ejection tool, and a set of white Apple stickers. So with the paperwork out of the way, we can see all 6 of our iPhones nestled in their boxes. And of course, because this is an iPhone X design, most of the display is all black until it's turned on. But you can still see the vibrant colors of the aluminum surrounding the bezel. So as we remove the plastic, you can see the design is somewhat similar to the iPhone 8 crossed with an iPhone X. You have the aluminum frame with the glass back panel, which allows for wireless charging, but that glass back panel is also the most vibrant color on the phone. The aluminum sides have an anodized metallic finish, which is a little lighter than the more vibrant colors on the back. Now the accessories are the same ones we get with other iPhones. We get a 5-watt travel charger, even though the iPhone XR supports rapid charging, but you have to buy that charger separately. We also get a set of earpods with an inline remote control and microphone, along with a lightning connector. So even though we don't have a headphone jack, you can use the lightning port for audio. And lastly, we have a USB-A to lightning cable. Setup with iOS 12 is extremely simple. All you have to do is hold your old phone next to the new phone, and you'll be prompted to transfer your information from the old phone to the new phone. The process is pretty simple. All you have to do is scan a code on the front of the new phone, and they pair together and hand off all the login information you would otherwise have to do manually. You're also prompted to set up Face ID for the first time, and it's a 2-step process. You basically scan your face twice by rolling it around. Kind of coaches you through the process, and they have sped up the performance of Face ID thanks to faster algorithms and a faster secure enclave. Also during setup is a demonstration of the True Tone display. So once again, this is a technology that matches the display's color temperature to the ambient lighting. The rest of the setup will talk you through Apple Pay and setting up Siri. We're also given the option to select standard or zoomed view. Now we're only seeing this with larger screen devices, so the iPhone XS doesn't offer this, but the XS Max does, and so does the XR. So basically you can choose whether you want larger fonts or smaller fonts, bigger icons, smaller icons. Now personally, I prefer standard, and that's what I'll be demonstrating. Taking a close look at each color, starting with blue. We've never seen this blue color on an iPhone before, unless you take a look at the iPhone 5C, and it's kind of similar. It's not exactly the same, but you can see it's in that same sort of family. It's more of a pastel blue or sky blue, so it's quite light. If you take a look at the edges of the phone, you'll see that aluminum, again, has that sort of metallic anodized finish, so it's not as solid as the color on the back. Overall, I think it's one of the best looking colors and certainly one of my favorites. Yellow is one of the most vibrant colors to pick from, and it's also kind of a pastel color, just like blue and coral. Now the yellow here is a little darker than the yellow from the iPhone 5C, which was more of a lighter pastel yellow. This is a little closer to a mustard yellow. The aluminum sides also have that more metallic, lighter yellow color, and because it's metallic, it's almost like a gold color. But if you compare this to one of the yellow golds that Apple used on some of its earlier iPhone designs, you can see it's not really that similar at all, so it's still a pretty distinct yellow color. Product Red is not a new color, but what's new this time is the fact that it's available at launch instead of halfway through the year and limited edition. So it's kind of nice to see this always available. Otherwise, the color scheme here is identical to what we saw with the 8 Plus. So we have the same sort of red glass on the back and that dark red frame. Coral is one of my surprise favorites. It's kind of an orange color, but it's more toward the salmon. It's not as pink as I think a lot of people assume it is, so you definitely want to spend some time with it if you're not clear on what this color actually is. It is somewhat similar to the iPhone 5C color, but it is a little more toward the orange or peach side. But again, you have that sort of metallic aluminum color on the side, which I think complements the back color quite a bit better than it does on some of these other colors. At first glance, white looks like the same white we get with other iPhones, but in fact it's quite a bit more white, if that makes any sense, compared to something like the iPhone 8. So if you compare that side by side, you can see that this is a much brighter or cleaner white. We still get that raw aluminum finish along the side, which is pretty classic Apple, but that white color is so much brighter than what we've had before. And lastly, we have black, otherwise known as not space gray, but they're actually kind of similar. So if you look at the iPhone 8 in space gray next to the black iPhone XR, you see that the glass on the back has that same sort of dark gray black color. But if you look at the aluminum, the XR is much darker than the space gray on the iPhone 8. So with all of the phones booted up to their home screens, you can see just how vibrant the new wallpapers are that match the colors. Looks pretty impressive side by side here. Now there's actually two versions of the wallpaper here, the one you see on the box cover and the one that's on by default. So basically each color has two wallpaper options. Now Apple used three methods to reduce the price of the iPhone XS to give us similar specs and a cheaper form factor. So the big difference really comes down to the LCD display, which is lower resolution than the OLED display on the XS or XS Max. We also get aluminum construction instead of stainless steel, and we only get one camera on the back. It's the same wide-angle camera on the XS and XS Max, but we lose the telephoto camera. There's a few other compromises. So for example, instead of an IP68 rating for the XS, we have an IP67 rating for the XR. The XR also did not pick up the gigabit LTE speeds of the iPhone XS, so it did not get those revised antennas. In terms of size, the 6.1-inch iPhone XR slots right between the 5.8-inch and 6.5-inch XS and XS Max. Now I think that's a little confusing to many shoppers because most people assume a larger phone is more expensive. That's not the case here. The 5.8-inch XS starts at $999 versus $749 for the XR. So what's the difference and why should you care? The big difference here is LCD versus OLED. OLED has those deep blacks and vivid colors, but there's a few other things here such as resolution. So the LCD display of the XR has a resolution of 1792 by 828. So that's good for 720p video. That delivers a very familiar 326 ppi. That's the same retina pixel density we've seen since the iPhone 4. It's also on the iPhone 7 and iPhone 8. But 326 is still quite a bit lower than the 458 ppi on the XS and XS Max. Both of Apple's LCD and OLED displays have the same brightness, around 625 nits. Both phones are color calibrated for the wide color spectrum of the DCI-P3 spec, but the iPhone XR doesn't fully support the HDR specs like the iPhone XS. One of the things you might notice about the iPhone XR is that it does have a noticeably thicker bezel than the iPhone XS and XS Max. Now LCD is not as flexible as OLED because it requires a backlight, so that backlight has to be designed to evenly light the entire panel, which gets a lot more difficult with rounded corners and smaller bezels. And even though LCD is not a bendable display technology like OLED, they've been able to tuck the display drivers underneath the display so you can get that edge-to-edge LCD design. So even though the bezels are slightly thicker than the OLED phones, this is still quite an achievement. Now because we don't have the pixel density of the OLED displays on the iPhone XS and XS Max, you'll notice that the corners have kind of an interesting solution for that. So because we have these radii around the display, in order to make it as smooth as possible, Apple actually changed the aperture of the pixels so they sort of fade out toward the corners. So it does a good job making those rounded corners look rounded instead of jagged. Even though it's not OLED, Apple's LCD displays are some of the best out there, and there's a number of reasons for that. So for example, it has a very even backlight. There's no splotchiness or edge leaking. It's completely uniform. The other technology that makes this display look so fantastic is dual domain pixels. It's the same technology they use on the iPhone 8. So that display technology solves some of the problems of LCD and maintains contrast and color accuracy off-axis. So when you tilt the phone, it does a pretty good job maintaining the brightness and color uniformity clarity of the display. You're still going to notice the backlight on the dark screen. So for example, if you're looking at a photograph that's surrounded by black, you'll see that the screen does show itself, but it's not too bad. And certainly it looks a lot worse in my demonstration here because I have the exposure ramped up on the camera to kind of magnify the effect I'm trying to show you. One of the other ways Apple has made this display cheaper is by removing Force Touch and replacing it with Haptic Touch. Now, Force Touch was pressure sensitivity on the display, and every other iPhone has it except the all-new iPhone XR. So Haptic Touch replaces it by using long presses and taptic feedback to replicate the same feature. Now, the haptic feedback feels identical to 3D Touch on the iPhone XS or XS Max. The only drawback is that it's slower than 3D Touch and it hasn't completely replaced the gestures that 3D Touch offered. But hopefully iOS will be updated in the future to incorporate more features. For the most part, the pixel density isn't really an issue. The only time I really notice it is with black text on a white background, and usually only at certain sizes or with certain fonts, so it's more noticeable in certain situations than it is in others. Another interesting size comparison is between the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus. So the overall size is right between them and it's smaller than the iPhone 8 Plus, but the screen is quite a bit bigger. So we have a 5.5-inch screen versus a 6.1-inch screen. Unfortunately, the iPhone 8 Plus is a true 1080p display with a higher pixel density, 401 versus 326, so it does look a bit sharper. Another benefit of this display is that it's more energy efficient than the larger, higher resolution OLED displays. That gives the XR the longest battery life of any of the iPhones. It has the second largest battery at just under 3,000 mAh, which is a little smaller than the 3,200 in the XS Max. For the most part, battery life is very similar to the XS Max until you start measuring screen time. But you get up to 90 minutes more battery life than you do in the 8 Plus, which has a much smaller battery. There's quite a bit going on at the bottom of these phones. We have a Lightning connector, which very cleverly has a color matching insert. So they paid a lot of attention to details, but with the exception of black, the speaker grills and screws are just silver on all of the other colors. Unlike the XS, we do get symmetrical speaker and microphone grills, but if you look closely, something you might have noticed is that the Lightning port is not aligned at the center of the edge. Instead, it's sort of shifted away from the display. We haven't really seen that before with an iPhone, but that's because they needed the room for the display just above it. But of course, there's more substance to talk about here. So we do get a new set of microphones which can pick up stereo audio for video, but we also get a stereo speaker design very similar to the XS. So we have a speaker on the bottom and a speaker in the earpiece for full stereo sound. Like the XS, the speakers have been tonally matched, so they have a much wider stereo sound. In fact, they sound basically identical to the iPhone XS Max. Just like the iPhone XS, we have an extra large side button, which replaces the home button for many functions such as Siri. We have our volume controls on the left side along with the mute switch. SIM trays normally aren't that interesting, but they're kind of interesting here in terms of the XR because the tray is so much lower than it is compared to other iPhones, so it's pretty far down on the right side. But just like the iPhone XS, the XR also gets a dual SIM thanks to an electronic embedded SIM or an eSIM alongside this nano SIM tray. Another feature completely carried over from the iPhone XS is the True Depth camera, which is used for Face ID and facial mapping for features like Animojis and Memojis. But Face Unlock is obviously the most useful feature because this allows you to quickly unlock or authenticate passwords or Apple Pay just by looking at your phone. This technology uses an infrared camera and a dot matrix projector, so it actually maps your face with invisible dots. Now you can see it thanks to my camera's infrared filter, but normally you don't see this. In fact, any flash you see at the top of the phone is because my camera is picking up, it's not actually visible. We also get the same new and improved Facetime Hd Camera, now recording 1080p video at 30 frames per second. Although the iPhone XR loses the telephoto camera of the XS, it does keep the same 12-megapixel camera from the XS, which has the new upgraded sensor, which is larger, so we get larger pixels and deeper trench isolation for better low-light performance. We still have everything that camera has, such as optical image stabilization. We also have the new and improved quad LED True Tone flash, and we get even more focus pixels, which gives us faster and more accurate autofocusing. Those focus pixels are actually used as an alternative to the depth perception of the dual camera phones. So thanks to the powerful ISP in the A12 chip, alongside facial recognition, the camera system can crunch the data to bring the portrait camera effects to the XR. The only drawback with the system is that it needs to recognize a face in the shot in order to apply the blurred effect around it. That's not the case with XS, which can work with any foreground subject. Unlike the dual camera setups, the XR uses the main wide-angle camera for portrait mode, while the dual cameras use the telephoto camera. So not only is low light performance better on that wide-angle camera, but it also means you don't have to stand as far back to get the shot. We also get the portrait lighting effects on the iPhone XR just like on the XS, but it's limited to 3 of them. So we get natural light, contour light, or studio light. But what we're missing from the dual camera iPhones is stage light and stage light mono. XR also picks up the depth controller of the iPhone XS, so you can change the blurred background effect as you change the aperture. So it's a virtual aperture, but the effect is pretty convincing. So for example, not only does the blur change in intensity, but the bokeh also changes. So for example, the optics of the bokeh will get wider as the depth gets shallower. Camera performance is identical to the XS, which makes this one of the best cameras you can buy on any smartphone at any price. And one of the biggest innovations with the XS is something called Smart HDR, which is actually baked into the ISP of the A12 Bionic chip. So this is able to combine a lot more images to sample both the contrast, brightness, and color of an image to make sure it's completely evened out, while still preserving a lot of detail. Just like the XS, we also get 4K video recording up to 60 frames per second, or slow motion up to 240 frames per second. Now because the true depth camera is identical to the XS, we don't lose any features on the XR. So that means we get portrait mode with depth control along with all of the portrait lighting effects. XR also gets the A12 Bionic CPU, the same 7nm chip inside the XS and XS Max. The only spec difference between the XS and XR is RAM, so the XR gets 3 gigs versus 4 gigs for the flagships. Ultimately, this means we get the exact same performance of the XS on the much cheaper XR. So checking out the interface for the iPhone XR, we do have raise to wake or we have tap to wake. So all I have to do is tap the screen to wake it up. Scans for your face automatically. I didn't have to act upon that at all. So it's extremely quick and seamless. So tap the screen, scans my face, swipe up to get to home. Now on the lock screen, we have quick shortcuts for the flashlight and the camera app. And instead of 3D touch, we now have haptic touch. So basically it's a long press, which is a little slower than force touch. Now from the home screen, you swipe down from center to get to your notifications, which are stacked on top of each other in iOS 12. Swipe down from the right corner to get to your control center. We do have haptic touch here as well, so you can long press on some of these items to expand them out. Even though this action is a little slower than 3D press, it's actually kind of nice to do a more light press in order to get to these controls. Not a huge loss, but haptic touch doesn't replace all 3D touch features. So for example, we lose app quick actions. So for example, if I 3D touch on the iPhone XS Max here, I get to these quick actions. For the iPhone XR, I just get to the editor. Another area I use 3D touch a lot is on the keyboard. So I can activate my cursor and move it around just by force touching on the keyboard to enter this trackpad mode. Very useful. Now we still have the same feature here, we just use the space bar. So you hold long press on the space bar and then you have the same function. Now because we do not have a home button, you just swipe up to get to home, and you can also swipe up again and hold to get to your recent apps. You can also swipe up to dismiss those apps. You can also just swipe across the screen like so to switch between your recent apps. In terms of useful button combinations, you long press to get to Siri, or you can use the wake up command. To take a screen grab, hold the volume up key and side key down at the same time and release. And to power down, hold the volume down key and side key at the same time. So in the end, there are many ways in which clever engineering and simplification have delivered almost all of the same features of the flagship phones. We get haptic touch replacing 3D touch. They've even been able to retain portrait mode for the single camera. Some of these cost compromises actually come with some added benefits, such as that more colorful aluminum design along with a slightly thicker phone, which gives you room for a larger battery. That gives us some of the best battery life among all of the iPhones. Beyond that, we're still left with an iPhone that adopts the stunning modern design and user interface of their flagship phones while maintaining almost all of the same performance and features of a much more expensive phone. And unless you focus entirely on pixel density as a metric, you won't find many other phones that can match the XR on performance, cameras, or the technology such as Face ID. But more to the point, iPhone users finally have an affordable upgrade option that doesn't leave them feeling left out and behind. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this look at the iPhone XR. If you guys enjoyed this video, please let me know with a like, and I'll see you again in my next video.